Class, this is Dr. Palmer here, and we're going to be talking here today about elections and voting behavior. This is chapter 10 from your text. And here's a quick overview of some of the things we're going to be looking at. We're going to look at how American elections work. We're going to distinguish the types of elections in the United States. We'll trace the evolution of the American electoral process from 1800 through to the present. We'll identify the factors that influence whether people vote or not, and assess the impact of parties' identification, candidate evaluations, and policy opinion options on voting behavior. And finally, evaluate the fairness of the Electoral College system for choosing the president, and assess the extent to which elections make government officials pay attention to what voters want. Elections socialize and institutionalize political activity, making it possible for most political participation to be peaceful and channeled through the electoral process. Because elections provide regular access to political power, leaders can be replaced without being overthrown. American voters rarely question the fairness of election results, allowing office holders to govern with legitimacy that they can take for granted. This chapter focuses on how elections work in the United States, who votes, and how individuals make their voting decisions. Unlike most other democracies, the United States has three kinds of elections: those which select party nominees, those which select office holders from among the nominees, and those in which voters engage in making or ratifying legislation. Elections in most other countries perform only the function of electing office holders. At present, there is no constitutional provision for specific policy questions to be decided by a nationwide vote. Procedures allowing the public to pass legislation directly have been in effect for quite some time in many American states. There are two methods for getting items on a state ballot. The first is via a referendum, whereby voters are given the chance to approve or disapprove some legislative act, bond issue, or constitutional amendment proposed by the legislature. The second method is through an initiative petition, which typically requires gaining signatures on a proposed law equal to 10% of the number of voters in the previous election. One of the most controversial propositions on any state ballot in 2008 was California's Proposition 8 regarding the state's definition of marriage. Over $75 million was spent by the two sides on the issue. In the end, the effort to outlaw gay marriage passed by a narrow margin. Elections have changed dramatically since 1800, when Adams ran against Jefferson. In 1800, there were no primaries, no nominating conventions, no candidate speeches, and no entourage of reporters. Both incumbent President John Adams and challenger Thomas Jefferson were nominated by their party's elected representatives in Congress through caucuses. Once nominated, the candidates did not campaign. They let their state and local organizations promote their causes. Although the election had to be decided in the House of Representatives, the transition from Adams to Jefferson marked the first peaceful transition of power between parties via the electoral process in the history of the world. By 1896, national nominating conventions had become well established. William Jennings Bryan broke the tradition and actively campaigned in person, traveling through 26 states. William McKinley ran a front porch campaign from his home in Ohio and managed to label the Democrats as the party of depression. The Republicans won overwhelmingly in the industrial Northeast and Midwest and became firmly entrenched as the nation's majority party for the next several decades. William Jennings Bryan was the Democratic Party's standard bearer at the turn of the century. Eastern industrialists, fearing Bryan's powerful speeches and populist politics, used their financial clout to help William McKinley defeat Bryan in the 1896 presidential election. Barack Obama catapulted to national prominence as a result of a debut speech that electrified the National Convention in 2004. Obama's message was one of unity and multiculturalism. Obama became the primary alternative to Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination in 2008. His call for change resonated slightly more effectively than Clinton's experience. Strong support from young people, the highly educated, and African Americans helped him win the nomination. John McCain had an easier time winning the Republican nomination. His reputation as a maverick had special appeal. The campaign began as a close race. Obama's perceived advantages were on economic issues and personal intelligence. McCain's perceived advantages centered on his foreign policy issues and political experience. The credit crisis in late September provided a turning point in the campaign. The intense focus on the economy for the rest of the campaign provided Obama with opportunity to emphasize his popular plans. Furthermore, McCain's choice for vice president, Sarah Palin, although an effective campaigner, failed to appeal to the larger electorate. Obama was also able to effectively link McCain to the widely unpopular President George W. Bush. Final results gave Obama 53% of the vote and McCain 46%. The people's verdict in 2008, just as in 1800 and 1896, was that it was time for change in Washington. Nearly 2 centuries of American electoral history included greatly expanded suffrage, or the right to vote. Ironically, proportionately fewer of those eligible have chosen to exercise that right. The highest turnout of the past 100 years was the 80% turnout in 1896. In 2000, only 51% of the adult population voted for president. Individuals with high levels of political efficacy and civic duty are more likely to vote, as individuals who see policy differences between the two parties. Political efficacy is the belief that ordinary people can influence the government. Some people will vote simply to support democratic government, that is, to make a long-term contribution towards preserving democracy. This is called doing one's civic duty. Although civic courses routinely stress that in democracy every vote matters, elections for public office rarely hinge on a single vote or end up in a tie. When the exception to the rule occurs, even on the local level, it often draws national media attention. Thus, the New York Times and other newspapers covered the story when an election for a seat to Cave Creek, Arizona town council resulted in a 660-660 tie, and the winner was decided by a card game represented by the town judge. The candidate on the right won. Before voting, citizens in most states must register to vote, often a cumbersome procedure. Largely to prevent corruption associated with stuffing ballot boxes, states adopted voter registration laws around the turn of the century, which require individuals to first place their name on an electoral roll in order to be allowed to vote. Although these laws have made it more difficult to vote more than once, they have also discouraged some people from voting at all. The Motor Voter Act, which allows individuals to register to vote when they receive or renew their driver's license, has made registration a little easier since 1993. There are several distinguishing demographic characteristics of voters and non-voters. Education, age, race, gender, marital status, mobility, and government employment. Research suggests that some political outcomes would change if this class bias in turnout did not exist. Politicians listen far more carefully to groups with high turnover turnaround rates, as they know their fate may well be in their hands. Who votes really does matter. Many journalists and politicians believe the winner of an election has a mandate from the people who carry out the policies he or she promised during the campaign. Conversely, political scientists know that different kinds of people vote a certain way for different reasons. Political scientists focus instead on three major elements of voters' decisions: voters' party identification, voters' evaluation of the candidates, and the match between voters' policy positions and those of the candidates and parties, known as policy voting. Because of the importance of party identification in deciding how to vote, the parties tend to rely on groups that lean heavily in their favor to form their basic coalition. Scholars single out party affiliation as the single best predictor of a voter's decision in the 1950s. With the emergence of television and candidate-centered politics, the hold of the party on the voter eroded substantially during the 1960s and 1970s, and then stabilized at a new and lower level during the 1980s. Political psychologists Sean Rosenberg and Patrick McCafferty show that it is possible to manipulate a candidate's appearance in a way that affects voters' choices. Other research has shown that the three most important components of candidate image are integrity, reliability, and competence. Policy voting occurs when people base their decisions in an election on their own issue preferences. True policy voting can take place only when several conditions are met. Voters must have a clear view of their own policy decisions. Voters must know where the candidates stand on policy issues. And voters must see a difference between candidates on these issues. And voters must actually cast a vote for the candidate whose policy positions coincide with their own. Research based on the 2000 election suggests that about 50% of survey respondents met the first three criteria. One recurrent problem is that candidates often decide that the best way to handle a controversial issue is to cloud their positions in rhetoric. Both candidates may be deliberately ambiguous. However, since the demise of party boss brokered conventions in the 1960s, candidates of both major parties tend to stray from the ambiguous center in order to appeal to their party's activists who vote in the primary season. That is, Democrats must appeal to liberals, and Republicans must appeal to conservatives. The presidency of George W. Bush has prompted an unusually great polarization of voters because of his strong and controversial stance. Please complete the following quiz in the EDU system. It is the electoral vote that actually determines the outcome of the presidential election. The founders created the Electoral College because they wanted the president to be selected by the nation's elite. Nevertheless, it has been customary since 1828 for electors to vote for the candidate who won their state's popular vote. The electoral vote may distort the popular vote. All states except Maine and Nebraska have a winner-take-all system in which electors vote as a block for the candidate who received the most votes in the states. One of the key reasons George W. Bush won the Electoral College vote in 2000 without winning the popular vote was that he did better in the small states. The winner-take-all rule also means that candidates will necessarily focus on winning the states where the polls show that there appears to be a close contest. For 4 years, members of the Electoral College meet in their respective state capitals to cast the ballots that actually determine who will be president. Here, Charlie O'Reilly from Plano, Texas, can be seen dropping his ballot for John McCain into the box at the state of Texas's official ceremony held in Austin on December 15, 2008. According to democratic theory, elections accomplish two tasks. They select the policymakers, and they are supposed to help shape public policy. In the hypothetical world of rational choice theory and the Downs model, elections do in fact guide public policy. Social science research on the question has produced mixed findings. Elections do affect public policy to some degree, and public policy decisions also partially affect electoral outcomes. The greater the policy differences between the candidates, the more likely voters will be able to steer government policies by their choices. If elections can affect policies, then policies can also affect elections. Most policies have consequences for the well-being of certain groups or the society as a whole. Those who feel better off as a result of certain policies are likely to support candidates who pledge to continue those policies, whereas those who feel worse off are inclined to support opposition candidates. This is known as the theory of retrospective voting. While the threat of election defeat constrains policymakers, it also helps to increase generalized support for government and its powers. Elections legitimize the power of the state, thereby making it easier to expand the size of the government. When people have the power to dole out electoral reward and punishment, they are more likely to see government as their servant instead of their master. As a result, citizens in a democracy often seek to benefit from government rather than to be protected from it. As democracy has spread, government has come to do more and more, and its size has grown.